Thank you very much, Professor Fan, for allowing me to make my presentation first in the pack. Thank you for your umpire. Okay, basically, my paper starts with a question. Why did China fail to modernize while Japan succeeded at the turn of the 20th century? Well, of course, this is a question that has been asked very frequently in the 60s and 70s. But considering the recent economic dynamism displayed by China, I think this question is worth revisiting, re-asking. If China was to develop later, why could it not earlier? And this is a related question, but if we want to explain China's economic development, China may be a particular case, but we have to look at the overall economic dynamism in the Northeast Asia as a whole. So I'm asking if there was a common factor shared by East Asian economies as a whole. This is where I bring in a new concept. I'm in the process of developing and elaborating cultural capital. Okay, these are the conventional explanations that were given in the 60s and 70s. There were basically two groups of theories. One is what we may call class theories. Of course, there is a wide variation in this group of theories, but the essence is can be summarized: no bourgeoisie, no development, as said by Barrington Moore. So when applied to East Asia, well, in Japan, there was a very thriving merchant class joining, but in China, the merchant class became gentrified, losing the entrepreneurial spirit. The second group of theories that can be called state theories. Basically, the theories are based on the European experience. So in the case of late development, the state played important roles, as in Russia. So this is often summarized as a Gershon-Cronian thesis. So when applied to East Asia, well, the Meiji state played its expected developmental roles properly, but the Chinese state basically stifled. It was dysfunctional in terms of development. And good example of the class theories is a paper written by Edwin Reischauer long time ago, 50 years, more than 50 years ago, where he contrasts the Chinese failure against the Japanese success. So he basically attributed the Japanese modernization to feudal tradition in Japan. So because the country was divided in the feudal system, Japan could responded more flexibly to the West, and they were better positions to absorb Western technologies. And in Japan, because of the rigid social class or social status system, the merchant class had to be content with their own status, the merchant class. So they developed a kind of a goal orientation. So they tried to achieve most in their own class. That's why merchant class developed in Japan. So the Japanese merchant class began to develop more entrepreneurial spirit and more advanced. In the end, it also resulted in advanced economic institutions in Japan. So basically, it says the modernity of Japanese tradition. On the other hand, bureaucratic centralization in China prevented the flexible response and varied response to the West. And Reischauer also mentioned that there was a certain class fluidity and social mobility in China that resulted in status orientation of the merchants. So basically, that resulted in gentrification. When the merchants accumulated a large wealth, first they bought land, and then they became a gentry class. So there was no such entrepreneurial spirit as displayed by the Japanese Chonin class. And as for the state, many theories. You cannot refer to my paper, which is included in the disk. Well, anyway, the prevalent view of a Chinese state was that it was a stifling state. Directly, the state forcibly controlled commerce. Indirectly, the state set standards of prestige and directed the aspirations of the able. So that's why it resulted in gentrification of the merchant class. And China's centralized bureaucratic state stifled the merchant class, while Japanese feudal state could not prevent rise of commerce and the development of an increasingly powerful and wealthy bourgeois class. So this is particularly emphasized by E.H. Norman. So because of the Sankin Kodai system that was practiced in feudal Japan, the daimyos had to take alternate residence in Japan and their domain. So they could not move their wealth, that was rice. So they had to sell rice, which resulted in the very complicated and sophisticated commercial system in feudal Japan. But these earlier conventional explanations, I think, have many problems. One is factual, the other is theoretical. Okay, these are the earlier explanations. Okay, in the case of the class theories, assume the direct relationship between bourgeoisie and industrial capitalism. But we know that, okay, this is the least sophisticated development theory, even when we look at the European experience. Okay, Germany had the most developed cities, while England the least developed cities. But it was England that developed first. And the assumption of entrepreneurial merchant class is also more assumed than the real. Well, in Europe and Japan, it was the state that prodded and encouraged the entrepreneurs, the merchant class, to engage in enterprises. The methodological problem is this. This is related to the factual problem. I think the Japan and China, as shown in this diagram, may share the many similarities, but Japan was compared to Europe, and China was compared to Europe. Okay, in the case of Japan, because Japan modernized, they were searching for the similarities to Europe. And in China, well, they were simply trying to find how China was different from Europe. So they ended up overemphasizing the differences between Japan and China more than similarities. So, was it the Qing state a real obstacle to development? Well, if we carefully look at the facts, Qing state was not fundamentally different from Meiji state. It sponsored pilot industrial plants, sent students abroad, built modern schools. And of course, these efforts were not sufficient enough to modernize China, but it was, but then what? Why Qing state could not do more? Well, according to Dwight Perkins, it was because of the lack of financial resources. So Qing state collected less than 2% of the estimated GDP at the time. So Perkins used this term. The failure of a Qing state was more sins of omission than sins of commission. Then, why could it not raise more revenues? This is a more proper question. So here comes the problematic articulation between the state gentry. Okay, the state, of course, this is a patrimonial state, and the upper echelon of the gentry were basically, at least the upper echelon of the gentry was the parcel and part and parcel of the state. The imperial state relied on the bureaucratic service of the upper echelon of gentry, while gentry relied their authority on their service to state. Okay, so so they shared, state and gentry shared common interests, but they had also conflict of interest, where they shared common interests in the imperial system, but they had different interests in exploiting the working class. So in China, the reform leadership had a vested interest in the existing imperial system in the end. That was why the various reform efforts had failed. The Tongzhi restoration, the self-strengthening movement, well, either because of the opposition from the imperial household or from the gentry class. In Japan, I will go over. Japan was different. The reform leadership was separated from land. And why then China could develop a century later? Well, basically, the class that were vying with the state was eliminated. And there was a reform leadership, and I would say that there was a proper policy mix, market reforms, and one of the main obstacles was financial restraints. Well, the same problem was there when China first opened up, began to reform. And that problem was partly solved by fiscal decentralization policy adopted by central government at the time. Culture cannot explain the vicissitudes of economic development in a single country. So as a political economist, I didn't look at culture very much, but because some turns and twists of my fate, I ended up paying more attention to culture. Cultural capital can explain, I believe, the reason why the economic dynamism. By cultural capital, I mean experience of governance, state capacity, record keeping, legal codification, meritocracy, legacy of learning and education, etc. This is a broader concept than used by Pierre Bourdieu. There's a typo. And it is also different from the governance because this is a historical transmitted political, social, cultural law, an institution that could be used for good purposes as well as bad purposes. But when a right leadership took up right policy mixes, then this cultural capital can play a tremendous role. And if measured in terms of cultural capital, not economic material capital, pre-modern East Asian countries were more developed than economic capital or GDP, a very poor indicator of wealth. Anyway, economic capital alone indicated. Thank you very much.